good afternoon, good evening. I suppose it depends on where you are. It's morning for me. It's pretty dark out there, but I've got a cup of coffee and I'm excited to present this masterclass to you about scaling impact. I think that this presentation offers a few challenges for me. There's apparently no presentations allowed, so I'm going to try to sneak in something that looks a little bit more like a movie or a slideshow. We can then discuss some of the ideas that I'm presenting. There are some notes that are available for this particular masterclass that Deepak will get a link to you to show you where they are. And if you're out there and want to say hi, go ahead and say something in the chat and let me know where you are. So why don't we go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you some slides, but I promise it's not a presentation, at least not in the traditional sense. All right. There we go. All right. We're going to talk about new ways to plan, manage, and evaluate scaling. This is based on a book that I wrote with Robert McClean called Scaling Impact, Innovation for the Public Good. And there's Rob and me standing next to the book. We got this out to the public around 2019, 2020. And this is our book launch at UNICEF in that year. Rob can't be with us today. He just got married. So I'm taking this all on my own. And a lot of the work that we developed started with our interaction with the community of evaluators South Asia and their conclave in 2017 in Bhutan. And a lot of our work really comes from our collaborations with innovators in the Global South, as I'll discuss. Well, what brought us to this topic to begin with? Well, this picture, which is on the cover of our book, I think provides an example of what the kind of questions that we were asking around scaling. This is a picture of a banana plantation in Mozambique. It's called Bananalandia. And there it is. It is so large that it transformed Mozambique from a net importer of bananas to a net exporter. It is a gigantic plantation. On the other side are smallholder farms known as mashambas, and they're spread throughout the country. And in this picture, what we see are two strategies for agriculture at very large scale. And there is this bright line dividing one from the other. And in looking at this, Rob and I ask questions like, well, who decides where to put the line? Who decides what the solution should be? How do we know that we've done a good job at choosing the right solutions and brought them to the right level of scale? And we didn't really have a way to get very good answers to this. And as we talked to innovators in the Global South, they were also asking similar questions and not getting very good answers. And the more we looked around, we saw that these were the kinds of situations that were apparent all over the world in our everyday life. People making decisions about large-scale solutions and choosing from more than one, deciding how much of one or the other. So Rob works for IDRC, and part of his work was doing research on the past 30 years of their grant making. And what he came up with was the idea that what was happening in the Global South was in fact quite different from what was happening anywhere else in the world around scaling. So we spent a great deal of time interviewing, working with innovators, trying to understand their perspective, and we took what we understood from them and put it into our book. which is really based on their work and our way of trying to understand the work of our collaborators. So the book is 4 principles. It has 5 case studies. But I think what I really want to work with you today about is this idea of a mindset. How do we change the way we think about scaling? And this was the challenge that was presented to us, and I think it was really quite useful. We've been able to present this to not just Southern innovators, but also Northern funders. And I think that it's had an interesting effect on the way they're thinking about scaling. This book is free. Thank you, IDRC, for making it available to the public. You can just go to the IDRC website, go to that URL. Or if you're not able to remember the URL or use the QR code, all you have to do is go to Google and type Scaling Impact IDRC, and you're going to get all the links immediately for the book and other resources. This is a link to the notes from today that I think Deepak has already made available to you. There are quite a number of resources, and rather than running through all of them, I thought what I would do is just mention one, which is something called the Scaling Exchange. And this is a place where, if you're interested, you may be able to get more involved with peers around the world who are interested in the topic of scaling. The Scaling Exchange is a group of leaders and innovators around the world, primarily in the Global South. And they have created a call to action around scaling. It has 8 points, and I'm going to run through them just very quickly. It's keep your focus on scaling impact, broaden your understanding of participatory approaches, make equity of impact an equal measure to magnitude of impact, address the environment as part of the scaling system, move beyond a project logic to fund impact, scaling only what works doesn't work, support a learning culture instead, support Southern solutions, and invest in the science of scaling. And I think this call to action reflects a level of dissatisfaction with the way scaling is being pursued right now, especially as it's being asked or at times mandated by Northern funders. That last bit about scaling science is sort of a larger umbrella under which this work falls. Scaling science is something that we might talk a little bit about today, but it probably goes beyond the scope of what we really want to cover. So what's the plan for today? There is actually a plan. If you can believe this, there's a plan. There we go. And what I'd like to do is first just talk about the concept of impact. Whenever we have discussions with innovators, professionals, funders, this term really makes the conversation difficult. So we need to be clear about what we mean. And then we're going to talk about scaling, which is also a bit of a stumbling block in terms of what it means at a conceptual level and how to take that and make it practical. Then I'll very briefly go through the 4 principles in the book. And then I'll spend a little more time on the 4th principle, which is dynamic evaluation. And I will go beyond the book at this point and really talk to you about some ways of thinking about evaluating scaling that I think are quite new. So let's start with those terms. And this is a sort of strange format because I do feel like I'm talking into the void. So please feel free to send comments or questions as we move along. At some point, I want to pose a few questions to you and see what kind of responses you might have to them. So Rob and I like to joke that it's very easy to understand scaling impact, except for the terms impact and scaling. And with impacts, it seems that most professionals learn about them in the context of logic models. So a logic model is this chain of events where inputs give rise to activities that an organization implements. Those activities create outputs. Those outputs create outcomes, and outcomes create impacts. So this can be a very useful way to think about it. Log frames are a very similar sort of thing. But note that impacts are only some of the consequences, because outputs and outcomes are also consequences. But they're not really considered when we use the term impact. Impacts are also generally the most important of the consequences, often the last to occur, and they have an implied counterfactual most of the time. And counterfactual is another term that can be quite confusing, but what we mean here is that when an organization says their impacts have made something better or that the world is different, we really need to know what it's better than or what it's different from. And the counterfactual simply states what you're comparing it to. So if people have an increased level of income, it's increased compared to what? And the counterfactual is simply an idea. We're not talking about necessarily doing some sort of RCT or having a control group or anything like that. All we're saying is that it should be stated clearly what it is you're making the comparison to. And with logic models, that typically isn't the case. We don't know if something's better. It's better than it would have been had nobody done anything. It's different than it would have been if somebody had done something differently. And that can be a little bit of a challenge in interpreting what is meant. For scaling, we want to broaden this definition. We don't want to think about just some of the consequences. We want to be able to consider all of them. Because when we scale, things happen that we don't anticipate. Things happen that we thought might have been good that turn out to not be well received. So we don't want to narrow our gaze. We want to try to broaden it as much as possible and consider as many of the consequences as we can. We want to consider consequences of any importance. And what I mean by that is, if I think that something is quite meaningful and critical to creating a better world, it could be the case that you don't believe that. And vice versa. There could be things that you think are very important and critical that I don't think are as important. So we have to be able to look more broadly at things that have any importance and understand how they're important to different groups rather than simply stating something is important or not. And we want to look at impacts that occur at any time. They could occur right after the activity, or they could occur years or decades later. And to the extent possible, we'd like to have an explicit counterfactual. That is, we like to say what these impacts are different or better than. All right, so that is, I think, something of a whole graduate level course right there. So maybe you have some questions about this, or not. This would be a great time for you to ask or send a comment along if you'd like. As I have a sip of my morning coffee. All right, well, it's quiet. It's quiet on the front, so I'm gonna go ahead and keep going. So let's talk about scaling. There's another term that people find a bit confusing. Oh, okay, I got a question. What do you think is more important from your perspective, output or outcome? Okay, that's a good question. Let me come over here. So in the framework of a logic model, generally speaking, outputs are considered less important than outcomes and outcomes less important than impacts. And that can be a very fine way to think about it. It can be very useful. That is a valued definition of impact. So we're placing values on what's happening. What we're offering or suggesting is that we should take a descriptive view of impacts. That is, we want to describe what is different and then think about how or if it's important and for whom. So an example would be a factory that is sending wastewater into a local river. In a logic model, that would be considered an output. But I might consider that quite an important thing, that I really want to track that. I wouldn't think of that as trivial or something I shouldn't be paying attention to. Especially if I live near that river, that's probably a really critical part of my day-to-day life. So it's not so much a case that one is always more or less important than another. In the framework of a logic model or a log frame, that is the assumption that it's built upon. But in reality, we can find that people think the outputs are more important than the impacts. So we want to give them that room to do that. These are different models of thinking about impact. One's not necessarily better than the other, but for scaling, especially since we don't know what's going to happen often when we bring something into the world at large scale, we don't want to narrow our gaze and say we're just going to focus on these impacts that we decided ahead of time are very important. Hope I answered that question reasonably well and not too long. Thank you for asking. All right. There we go. So scaling is a term that's used in a lot of different ways, and I want to give you a set of terms and some meanings around them. These are not used 100% consistently, but I think once you see this, you'll begin to recognize that when organizations scale, they have a lot of choices about how they go about doing that. And I'm going to use this metaphor of an apple tree to present this to you rather quickly. Perhaps the most common term we hear is scaling up. And what that typically means is, well, it'd be like taking that apple tree and growing it larger so it produces more fruit. So if you're running a program, you're going to get more participants into the program. If you're selling a product, you're going to sell more of that product. There's also scaling out. And that would be like taking that tree and growing more, creating a whole orchard in order to have more apples. So scaling up is a bigger tree, scaling out is more trees. There's also something which is referred to as scaling deep. And this is when you nurture the tree so that it produces larger apples that are more delicious, right? So you're improving the quality of what you're doing by scaling deep. Now you can combine these, they're not one or the other. You can scale up and out, and you find that oftentimes organizations are using a combination of these strategies. There's also something which is known as emergent or transformational scaling. So rather than trying to take a tree and turn it into an orchard, what you're trying to do is change the tree into a forest, which is something entirely different and connected in a system that has many moving parts. There's also something which is known as horizontal scaling. And here the idea is that you're going to increase the variety of impacts that are very similar to each other, in the sense that you'll have, say, growing apples that are red, growing apples that are green, growing pears. All of this is more or less coming from the same kind of activities. There's vertical scaling, which is looking at the whole, you might call it the whole value chain, or if you're thinking about it in terms of a logic model, every step along the way. Within this metaphor of an apple tree, it'd be like, you're saving the seeds that you use to grow the apples, and then you go off and you sell the apples. So all along this chain of events, you're taking some level of control which helps you improve the quality and the quantity of what you're doing. There's also something known as concentric scaling. And this is where you use your core competencies to do things that might qualitatively be quite different. So if you're very good at growing apple trees and running an orchard, you might decide your core competency is really orchard management. And so that's what you go out and you sell, and you do that. So that's concentric scaling, using your core competencies in ways that may be entirely different qualitatively from what you've done before. There's also something called same scaling. And same scaling is the decision to continue doing exactly what you've been doing. Sometimes that is the best decision. There is descaling, which is the decision to do less, or perhaps to stop altogether. And finally, there's something that we might call pseudo-scaling, which has all of the sort of superficial attributes of scaling, but none of its benefits. And so that's a lot, and that's in the notes, and some of that is in the book as well. And I guess what I want to say is that any and all of these, except for pseudo-scaling, which seems like not a very good idea, all of these are okay. You can go about using them in any way that makes sense in your context for your purposes. But what I'd like you to note is that all of those describe ways of changing operational scale. It's about how organizations act differently when they scale. And what we want to understand is that organizations are acting differently in order to make impacts different. Right? That's why we're acting differently, is to make the impacts different in some way. A lot of what we've learned about scaling has come from business, where organizations are acting differently in order to make more money. And the things we've learned there, some of that is quite useful, but it's incomplete. And this is part of where the dissatisfaction comes from. Because when you're scaling impact, you really are taking on a different kind of problem. So we want to think about acting differently to make impacts different, understand that the acting differently is a means, and the impacts being different are the ends. And we would like to focus on the ends, not the means. The ends are impact, which is why we refer to what we're doing as scaling impact. So I think it's really quite a useful thing to differentiate between operational scale and scaling impact. And if you're a manager, if you're working for an organization that is trying to scale its impact, much of your day, most of your problems have to do with how you change operational scale. So it's natural that our attention falls to that. But we want the ways in which we scale to support the ways that we want impacts to be different. Now, I'm going to talk more about what that means for impacts to be different. But this idea, this distinction between operational scale and scaling impact is really a kind of foundational idea for what we're doing. All right. Again, I've covered an awful lot in a very short period of time. If you have any questions or comments, it's a good time to do it. It's also time for me to have some coffee. Yeah, it's still pretty early here. Wow, what are the limitations of logic models? Ooh, yeah. So currently, I'm working on another book, which is really all about impact. The working title is the Meaning and Measure of Impact. And the general thesis for this book is that impact has multiple fairly precise technical definitions. And as evaluators, we tend to only use one of them, which is the impact, the notion of impact that falls within logic models. So one of the ways that I think that logic models may fall short is that is that if we treat them as the sole or only way to think about impact, if we can combine and incorporate these other definitions, I think we actually get much more leverage on solving problems. Another potential problem with logic models, I mean, everything has its virtues, right? So it's not as if something is evil and this should never be used. They're great and should be used exclusively. But one of the things about logic models is it tends to change the problem of thinking about imagining what a cause and effect relationship would look like into sort of filling in the blanks exercise, right? I need some outputs. I need some outcomes now. I need some long-term outcomes. I need some impacts. And so you're trying to fill in a schema, and this idea in which you're filling in the blanks, I think, changes the way we think about causal relationships in a way that sometimes is useful for us, but sometimes isn't. A lot of my work has been helping organizations design their impacts, and we try to do it in a way that is not overly constrained. And so we don't use logic models to begin with. We use other methods, and then if necessary, we can take them and express them as logic models. But the idea generation part of what we're doing tends to flow much better when it's looser and doesn't have the labels attached to them. At least that's what I've found. All right, well, yeah, if you get me on the topic of all the different notions and definitions of impact and how they integrate and how to use them, we could be here for a pretty long time. All right. Hopefully that was helpful. Let me know. All right, where do we want to go from here? I think I want to go over the 4 principles that are in the book. And they're, I'm going to go over them pretty quickly. I gave you, there's a 1-pager that we have online that I included in the notes that summarizes the 4 principles. And there are 4 chapters in the book that go over it, so there's a lot there. But the first principle is justification. And the idea here is that scaling is a choice. Like, organizations don't have to scale their impact. They don't have to scale their operations. They don't have to scale at all. It's a choice. Increasingly, though, there's something that we refer to as the scaling imperative. Organizations feel like they must be scaling their activities. They're being pushed to scale what works by funders. And they're putting into proposals for something that they've never done before, the argument that it's scalable, even if we don't know if it's something that is effective or is worthy of being scaled. So scaling is a choice, and we should approach it as such. That choice is shared. Right? The organization on its own shouldn't be making the choice to scale. It is shared with the people who are affected. If we scale, are we going to do something that people value and matters? And that choice should be based on evidence and values. So there's a lot of talk around evidence-based programming and scaling what works, and we should be using evidence, but also we need to connect it to the values of people who may disagree on what matters. We have to find ways to reconcile that. And if we're an organization that's seeking to generate a profit in addition to doing something good, we have to find a way to balance the values and desires around those 2 objectives. All of this together, we suggest should change the way we talk about scaling. Rather than starting with the question, how do we scale? And most of what we find in the literature is about how to scale. We really need to start with the question, should we scale? And this is a much more difficult question to answer, and one that is answered best in collaboration with others. So a big part of this is something which is called impact risk. And in making a decision whether to scale or not, we should be making a decision about whether the rewards outweigh the risks. An impact risk is the risk that organizations fail to produce impacts that stakeholders desire, or they produce impacts that stakeholders find undesirable. And if you think about something like, say, this iPhone, there we go. When this was first introduced, nobody had any idea how it was going to change the world. And it's changed it radically in ways that no one anticipated. There were quite a number of risks associated with it that probably no one really thought of. And whenever we introduce something in the world, we should spend at least some time reflecting on that. And within impact risk, there are some dimensions that are worth thinking about. One is certainty. How certain are we that we're going to get the results that we think we're going to get, especially if we're changing something about scale? Stake. What's at stake and for whom? And then tolerance. How much tolerance do stakeholders have for the risk? Right, so these three issues really are important touch points for us as we're thinking about risk. So if we take the first one, certainty, we could put that on a continuum, and we could look at this and say, right, we can be more certain or less certain that we're going to create the impacts that stakeholders desire and avoid those they find undesirable. And if we have a very high certainty, we'd be over here onto the right side of this diagram. So something like pharmaceuticals probably should be far over there before we decide to go give them to people, right? We don't want to mix up some chemicals in our bathtub because we have a great idea and then start selling them to people on the street the next day. It's generally considered a very bad idea. On the other side, we might have very low certainty. And for something like fine art, well, I don't really need much certainty before I just go and put it out into the world. I can create a work of art one day and put it in a museum the next. So depending on what we're scaling, depending on what the risks are, we might find that we need more or less certainty before we're comfortable scaling. Now, your innovation, your program, your product, whatever you're working on, probably falls somewhere between fine art, which we can just put out there without any consideration, and pharmaceuticals that require real care and consideration. Now, where that is hard to say. Only you do. And that helps you decide whether or not you should be scaling right now, or how much you should be scaling, or the way you should be scaling. Right? Trying to figure out where you are in terms of that level of certainty. And if we build that out just a little bit more and add another dimension to it, we can think about operational scale on this dimension, where at the bottom we have small scale, or essentially doing the same thing that we're quite comfortable with and understand, or large scale, or something that's different that really introduces uncertainty. And the relationship probably, looks a little bit like this. We might think it looks like this, where there's an area where we would say the risk is justified because our certainty of the impact is greater than, it's justifying the scale of operation that we're at. And if we're up here, it's not justified because we don't know enough to be operating at such a large or different scale. Probably that's not a straight line. It probably looks something like this. And with this curve, which is the way we've been thinking about it, we divide that space into three groups, where there's impact risk is too high at one point. So that would be like treating pharmaceuticals like it's fine art. And then there's impact risk that's too low, which would be treating fine art like pharmaceuticals. It doesn't make sense to have to go out and do an RCT to decide whether or not to hang a painting in a museum. Somewhere between the two is acceptable impact risk, and that's what we're searching for. And when we're there, then it's possible to justify scaling. Where is that point? It's hard to say. It depends on context, and people will have different opinions about that, which is why collaborating and working with stakeholders is important. Now, if our urgency changes, like if we have a more urgent problem, we may be willing to accept more impact risk, right? So context matters, and urgency is a real issue around this. During COVID, we were willing to get vaccines out to the public with slightly less vetting than we would do normally because of the urgency of the problem, and that seemed justified. Now, here's an issue for us to consider. A funder may look at the problem one way on the left. They may have a fairly high tolerance for risk. A community that's affected by the work of that funder may have a lower certainty or lower tolerance for risk. And so I think a practical question for us is how do we resolve these differences? And this is, I think, something that we see a lot in practice. Funders are pushing for scaling. They'd like organizations to scale faster and larger. And communities are oftentimes not quite certain that that's a good idea. I don't know, perhaps this is something that you've come across in your own work. Maybe this is something that you've observed in the communities in which you live. Oh, that is not where I'm going. There we go. Come in here. All right. Again, I've just laid a huge amount of information on you in a short period of time while I'm still asleep. Comments? Questions? All right. Let's move on then. Let's look at optimal scale. That's the second principle. More is not always better. Better is better. We often think about scaling as something which is entirely about magnitude or quantity or reach. And those are important parts of what we want to understand when scaling. But it's not the only way to think about it. We're suggesting a more holistic approach to thinking about impacts. And they have various dimensions that we may be concerned with. One is magnitude. How much, how many? That can matter quite a lot. But also variety. As we scale, the opportunity arises to create more and different kinds of impacts. In equity, we'd like the impacts to be equitable, that the benefits don't all accrue to one group and not to another. And sustainability, we'd like the impacts to promote sustainability of the environment, of society, and we'd also like the impacts to last. So these four are dimensions that we've suggested. We're not saying they're the only dimensions that matter, or that we should be limiting ourselves to these alone. But I would say that it's a good starting place. You can add to them, subtract to them. But when we talk about making impacts different, we're talking about making them different in terms of their magnitude, their variety, their equity, and sustainability. That's a pretty good starting place for us, I think. And I would invite anybody to amend that list to make sense in their context. See that I do have a question here or a comment. It seems to me that funders also have a low impact risk category, and especially they focus on things that they know. Yes, I think this gets to the question of what is at stake. So what's at stake for a community may be well-being, education, health. For funders, oftentimes what's at stake is reputation, or if it's an individuals within the organization, sort of their success, their jobs, right? They want to see that the organizations they're funding aren't doing something that might appear to be look like failure. Even though when we scale, we'd expect that a number of those scaling exercises won't bear fruit. That's just normal. Right. So I think you're absolutely right that they oftentimes have low tolerance for risk on some dimensions. Where they have high tolerance for risk with respect to communities is that most funders don't have the same, they're not going to have their lives changed if the organization is more or less successful in producing its impacts, right? They're not going to have their education of their children diminished if the schools they're building aren't effective. They're not going to have their health put at risk if the clinics that they're supporting aren't as effective as they'd like. So they're somewhat insulated from the impacts that they're trying to create, and that changes their risk profile. Right, another question. Okay, how can scaling magnitude help to reduce the risk of system failure? Well, I suppose that depends on what you mean by system failure. So I'll interpret that one way. Hopefully, it's close. So if we take a system in a community, say a healthcare system, an education system, magnitude may, not necessarily, help reduce the risk of that system failing. One way is to ensure that there are enough people in the system, that there's critical mass. So it's hard to run a school system, for example, if not many people are there. Another way that magnitude can help, and magnitude is not just how many people, or what sometimes is called reach, but also can be the effectiveness, like how big is the impact. So if the impacts do increase in size, that also can support the health of a system by having critical parts of the system shored up so that the rest also benefits. One of the things about systems that people who work with them, I think, understand quite well, but is oftentimes hard to discover and communicate, is that there are certain parts of the system that may be more critical to the health of that system than others. And shoring those parts up can lead to the system overall developing greater health. All right, more, I think. What are the potential pitfalls of using scaling magnitude? Oh, yeah, I'm going to show you one. So I'm going to show you a picture of a pitfall under another one of the the principles. Magnitude isn't necessarily a bad thing to consider. I think what we're trying to suggest is that we've only been thinking about magnitude with relation to scaling. It's always the idea that scaling means more, and more is bigger, bigger organizations, more money, more people, more participants, more products. And that's a holdover from thinking about scaling as it relates to commerce, because there's a much stronger relationship between making more money and selling more products and having more customers and gaining a larger market share. So that relationship is much tighter than it is with scaling impact. there are quite a number of things that may want to change, like equity. Like we can be scaling in order to simply change the equity of the impacts without the magnitude in any meaningful sense changing. So it's one dimension. It can be quite useful. You know, if you're providing education in a large country like India, yeah, magnitude matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. This is my teacherly pause to give you a chance to either comment or not. All right, so these are 4 dimensions. When we think about changing impacts, we can think about the impacts being changed on these 4 dimensions. They could be changed on other dimensions too. And you should be free to think about what they are. Now here's, as you begin to think about this as dimensions, right? You might say, right, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if I knew what the maximum was and I could just crank them all up to the maximum? That's what I'd really like. That would be the ideal scaling solution for me, right? But in reality, you know, it looks more like this. You can't get everything to the maximum. You might not be able to get anything to the maximum. And some things you may be able to achieve more than others. And if this is what you're seeing, all right, we've got pretty good magnitude, variety. I'd like more of that. Equity, not so good. You might say, well, let's try to adjust that. Let's try to increase magnitude. And if you do, you might find that other things change in ways that are unpredictable. You might try to make another change. I want more equity. And you may find it has other effects. So these dimensions can be related to each other, and there are typically trade-offs among them. Right? So rather than just thinking about them as independent things that we can pursue, we also want to consider how they're related to each other and how changing one might change the other. For example, if you're changing equity, you may be changing who you're serving, and that may reduce the number of people you're serving because you're focusing more on a particular group that has a greater need, and they may require more effort. So these trade-offs exist, and trying to predict them and trying to decide what is reasonable and balanced is quite difficult. And so we're left often with this question is, how can we know whether changing operational scale is successful if there are trade-offs? If everything's not just going up, some things may come down. How do we define success? And this is a real question, a real practical question that we face. Again, my teacherly pause. I'm realizing that there's a considerable lag in typing. All right, let's move on to the next. Send your questions or comments along whenever you want. All right, so the third principle is coordination. All right, so you're going to go off and scale, make the world better. That's great. But you're unlikely to solve large problems all on your own, because we're working in complex systems. And to do that, we need to bring along organizations, other actors who are going to support our work. And as we scale, that group is going to change. So we need an evolving set of actors as we move through a scaling process, a scaling journey. And we're going to run into things that we don't anticipate. So we need to be flexible in that scaling process. So we come into this complex environment. We're going to bring along other organizations and supporters that are going to help us. We know as we move along that journey at different points, we're going to need to bring in different actors, and we should coordinate that and be prepared for that. And we should be prepared for the fact that we're going to run into things that we don't expect. And that length of time over which that journey takes place can be quite long. Now, in our longer workshops, we spend some time thinking about how do we plan this? How do we plan for this level of coordination? What are the actors should we bring in? What should that journey look like? Where are the points along that journey where we have to make decisions? What triggers that decision? What kind of information do we need? And this is really quite difficult and takes time in real world settings. And it's quite different than what we've learned from business. We're scaling in the business environment more and more today is about leaping in and trying to learn quickly and change. And this is more difficult to do when there are negative consequences to not being successful that affect people's lives. So if you're bringing a new tech product into the world and you're trying to see if there's a market for it, then yes, you might just bring it to the market as quickly as you can, a very small version of it, and see if anybody buys it. If nobody does, all right, you can begin to understand why and make some changes to that product and then try it again. But if you're putting a healthcare clinic into a community and it doesn't really work, then people's lives are put at risk because of that. So we need to approach the scaling process differently than we see in business. Just leaping in often is not the best thing to do. And here's where I want to show you something about the pitfalls of magnitude within coordination. This is a photo that was shared with me by colleagues at Engineers Without Borders. And I don't really know that much about the provenance of the photo, except that it's a village and it has wells. But notice I said wells plural. It has 1, 2, 3 wells. Each well was drilled by a different NGO. Each NGO had a mandate to scale. Scaling was defined purely in terms of magnitude, the number of wells drilled. So in an uncoordinated fashion, these NGOs went scrambling around the countryside looking for villages and drilling wells. And every well they drilled, they got credit for having scaled their organization by having that well. But they weren't scaling impact, right? After the first well, it's unlikely that this village benefited in any way by having additional wells. Moreover, there are probably 2 villages out there without wells because they were drilled here instead. Right? So this is a real issue around thinking about magnitude alone, and especially in an uncoordinated way. I think that we could imagine that this story would be quite different, even if they focused only on magnitude, if they had coordinated their efforts, and if they had spent some time thinking about how to prioritize this. But this is a real risk when our gaze is too narrow just for magnitude, when we're confusing operational scale, drilling more wells, with impact, scaling impact, which in this case, there was no impact change after the first well. All right. I got a couple more comments here. It also helps to identify potential bottlenecks or areas of weakness in the system's design, allowing for changes to be made to ensure the system is robust and reliable. Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. If you understand correctly, I'm trying to suggest this. Yes, exactly. And they may not only be bottlenecks, right? There are, within a system, there may be weak points that if you strengthen, they will improve the system overall. But there are also places in a system that might be quite strong. And if you strengthen them, will also have these sort of non-linear benefits, like they'll be leveraged to that in a way that seems you're getting more out of it than you're putting in, right? There also can work the other way around, where there are parts of the system, if you bring them down, if you remove them or diminish them, can improve a system. So it's not just more, but yeah. All right. What am I looking for here? All right. So this is not a good story with the 3 wells. Scaling done wrong. Okay. So I'm going to move to the 4th principle. Thank you for your comments. Keep them coming. Your questions. Okay. Sorry, I'm fiddling with my computer. There we go. All right, dynamic evaluation. This was, in writing the book, this was an interesting part of our work as we were beginning to explore how to evaluate scaling efforts. Rob and I and the innovators we were collaborating with were pretty certain that we didn't think that the available tools and evaluation really covered what we were trying to understand. So we said, oh, we need something else, a kind of dynamic evaluation. And so we said, yeah, let's do that. Without fully understanding what we meant by that at the time when we wrote the book. A lot of our work since then has been fleshing this out, and I'll be talking to you about that. But here's the idea, and I think it's actually a pretty powerful idea. And that's that scaling is an intervention. Now, we often talk about scaling an intervention, but I want to be clear that scaling is an intervention, right? Because we change the way an organization acts in order to change impacts. So scaling is an intervention to change something about impacts. Because we're working in complex environments, because scaling introduces change, it actually is quite dynamic, right? So the change is not the way we usually think about it in a logic model, where we do X, then we get Y, and that's static and that's done. As we scale, the change itself is changing. It's a dynamic change. And our current methods of evaluating aren't really geared towards addressing that dynamic change. And that's why we need to do dynamic evaluation before, during, and after scaling, right? We can't just do it the way it sometimes happens, especially in the development world, where somebody comes in after the fact and looks at what happens and checks some boxes. You're trying to understand a river as it's flowing. And you don't do that by standing next to the ocean and seeing it empty itself out. It doesn't work that way. You need to understand its motion throughout the entire journey and how that's changing, and it's changing course along the whole way. Right, so we proposed this as a solution, but we realized that what we ended up doing was just presenting more challenges for evaluators. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are and how we can maybe address them. But before I start to do that, I think it's good to check in with all of you to see if you have any comments or questions, and to see if there's something in particular you'd like me to address before I sort of move on to yet another big topic in a short period of time. And I'll have a sip of my coffee while we do that. All right. I'll keep them coming. Uh, I'm going to start moving into some of these challenges. So there are four that I think are worth noting. The first is that we're trying to understand new types of relationship. As I mentioned before, we think of logic models, and the typical model of understanding impact thinks about change as being somewhat static. We take an action, we get a result. And then that holds true, right? When we think about what works, what we're saying is there's a reliable way to produce an impact, and that's always going to be the case. But we want to think about dynamic relationships, and they're different, and we're not really that well prepared to understand them. So dynamic relationships is the second challenge. The adding complexity is the third. I'm not sure we're going to have time to talk about that, but we need to think about systems in a more complex way, but there's a limit on how much complexity we can actually make sense of. And then an idea of a scaling theory of change. So if scaling is an intervention, then we can provide some kind of theory of change around that as well. But those theories are going to be different because they're not, we're talking about how scaling affects impacts. And I don't think we have a strong theoretical basis for that. So these are real challenges for doing this with some real, to really undertake this in a serious manner and to understand the effects of scaling. So let's look at number one and the new types of relationship. So action leading to impact. This is probably the relationship that we as evaluators or as nonprofit organizations or funders or policymakers, this is the relationship that we have focused almost all of our attention on. How do the actions that we take create an impact? And when we try to evaluate that, we might call that impact evaluation. Oftentimes it is a summative evaluation, and we're looking back, trying to see how the actions created the impact. If we're looking forward, sometimes that we can do that as well. And investment evaluations are just that. Investors are oftentimes trying to evaluate how the actions will create impacts. And those investors may be, philanthropic funders or governments, but they could be impact investors. So we're looking to make money as well as create good. So this is a relationship I think we're familiar with. We look at it backwards, we look at it forwards. It's really dominated our thinking. The second relationship that we spend a lot of time on is this, and this diagram may seem a little strange because we have an arrow going to an arrow. But what this means is that context changes the way in which actions create impacts. Context could make it easier for the things we do to create an impact, or it could make it harder, for example. Context could change the quality of the impacts. They could make them more or less equitable, for example. The same thing done in different contexts will get you different results. And that's what this means. In the world of evaluation, there's something called realist evaluation, in which this relationship matters quite a lot. All right, these two relationships, this is what we have focused most of our time on, either as evaluators or people creating change, social entrepreneurs, impact investors, philanthropic funders. This has sort of been our world. But scaling changes all of that, because scaling is about changing actions in order to change impacts. And if we do that really well, it's possible that the impacts will have different magnitude, different variety, different equity, different sustainability. We could really be making big changes in some combination of those four dimensions and others. And if that happens, the impacts can change the context, right? Think about just the magnitude. If you have an area with no access to any kind of health services, and then everybody has great access to health services, you've changed the context in which you're in. You may make it easier, for example, for people to maintain their health because you're able to deal with certain ailments early on. It could also work the other way. We could change our context in a way that makes it more difficult for us to create impacts. In addition to that, scaling just on its own, regardless of how it changes our impacts, just undertaking scaling can affect context. And a primary example of this would be if you're an organization receiving funding and you're tapped by a funder to scale, it means that no other organizations doing similar things in your area are likely to get that funding or any funding. So suddenly you've changed the context by not having alternate possibilities in the same space where you are. So in the past, we've really focused on these two relationships that we understand pretty well. Now we have to really focus on 5. And for 3 of them, I don't think we really understand how to evaluate them well. And this is the core piece that we are thinking about with dynamic evaluation. Yes, this very simple model can be increased and added and elaborated, and we think it should. Action, what does that mean? It has many moving parts. But as a starting place, just as a kind of schematic to say, what are the relationships that we're trying to understand? We think this is the simplest starting place that captures the important complexity that we're trying to make sense of. And I don't know how we do this well, because we don't really have a body of knowledge and experience around this, both in the planning, management, and evaluation parts of our work. All right, so we call this the dynamic evaluation systems model, because we can't come up with a better name. But this may be a good point to pause and see if there are any comments or questions. All right, I got a couple here. In your experience, does the model of the 4 dimensions you indicated for scaling impact work with impact investors that are seeking financial returns, or only for those that are impact first types of organizations? Yeah, good question. I think the issue here is around 2 things. One is, how do you decide what is good? Right? When we talk about organizations pursuing impact, or an impact investor trying to create impact, we're usually talking about them trying to create a good thing or to diminish a bad thing, right? A lot of what we're suggesting is that how we make sense of good and bad has to come from the people who are affected. And the value that's placed on the consequences of scaling also has to come from the people who are affected. Does it matter to them? Does it change their lives in real ways? And if we take seriously this idea that we're working with dynamic relationships and that we can't fully understand them, then it's quite possible that we're going to find that as time goes on, we're either going to create something in terms of impacts that people don't value, or that people could change the way they value the impacts that are there. And I think you're quite right in pointing out that this creates a kind of risk for investors if scaling is tied to their financial success, as it traditionally has been in business. So an impact investor might say, right, you've got a great, interesting social enterprise. We're going to put some money into that. It's going to do good things. And it's really important that that social enterprise grow, because that's how I get a return on my investment. But if that growth is not valued by the community that it serves, or it creates change that wasn't predicted to begin with, then yes, there's a real struggle. And the question here is, how much attention do investors want to pay to their impacts? And so far, that hasn't been very much. And how willing are they to amend what they're doing, even if it puts their financial returns at risk? And again, they haven't been very willing. And I think this is part of the dissatisfaction around scaling. If scaling means one group gets what they want and another group doesn't, it's hard to view that as success. All right, I was on my soapbox there. Does a bit of pivot assist in scaling? Yeah, maybe a lot more than pivot. I mean, sometimes the best thing to do with scaling is stop as you learn that the thing that you're doing isn't really going to produce the kinds of results you want. There's a lot of uncertainty, Yes, being flexible matters. Being able to pivot matters. Being able to start and stop and maybe start something entirely different, even more than a pivot, just like go to an entirely different enterprise. Sometimes that's the best thing. Yeah. How to prevent the loss of control and visibility when scaling an organization. I feel this can be challenging to apply. Principle of scaling. Can you share which parameters can be fixed and variable when organizations want to do scaling? Yeah, loss of control and visibility. So it depends a little bit on how we're scaling. So if we're talking about scaling that requires an organization to grow, to have more employees, to be in more geographic locations, something changes qualitatively about the organization. There is, in some sense, a loss of control, because in the past, when it was smaller, everyone involved had some substantial effect on what was being done. People could come together and find agreement and go act on it. As an organization gets large, that tends not to happen as much. It can be more hierarchical. Control can fall into the hands of a few. And if there's investment funding, investors who are looking to make money, a lot of control goes to them. And that changes the dynamic of what's being done. Decisions are made often around how to grow the organization for financial purposes, maybe in ways that conflict with what the impacts may be. So yes, there's oftentimes this bit of control. Some of that is, I think, can be addressed through the coordination principle. Who are you working with and how are you working together? And learning to see the right kind of control. Because as an organization, you don't want to be in control of everything. You want the people who are affected to have a level of control as well, right? You serve their lives, their needs. And if you're not doing that, then you're not actually successful in what you set out to do. So you want them to have a fairly high level of control over how you act. Now, how you do that, the mechanism by which you do that, it can vary from just listening intently and responding to having people in the community serve on your board alongside private investors. So there are different ways to try to make that work. I'm not sure that there's a general sense of what should be fixed and what should be variable. But I have seen many organizations set out their own principles and to use those as a way of describing what should be fixed and as a touchstone for evaluating whether they've been successful. I think that can be a really good way to go. All right. Okay, no more comments. Yeah, so this dynamic evaluation model, I think, is um, for me, it's been a very useful way to begin thinking about scaling, evaluating scaling, because I can begin to lay out these various types of relationship and ask, where are they? Where are they likely to happen? What might they look like? So in the next bit, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to do that quickly and then give you a chance for more questions. So please just send your questions and comments along. So challenge 2 is this notion that the relationships are dynamic, right? We said we have these different kinds of relationships, but they're dynamic. And what do we mean by that? Well, actions go to impacts, like we talked about. And in the past, we would look at this and say, hey, does it work? In this model, it's more complicated. And because of these interactions, it could be that as we scale, the impacts become more or less likely. They become larger or smaller. They become faster or slower to manifest. We can see different variety of impacts as we scale, and different qualities in general around the impacts. Right. So as we scale, these things are constantly in flux. And that's what we mean by the relationships being dynamic. All of that we can roll up into something that we call scaling effects. And I'll just give you a few examples of what they look like. So if we just look at a quick chart where we think of operational scale with similar to different or smaller to bigger, and then impact just, generally is worse or better, right? We sometimes have this idea that, all right, this is where we are. We are at this level of operational scale, and our impacts look at this level of good to somebody. And in our minds, we say, we want to scale. So if we scale, what it'll look like is this. We just draw a straight line. And if we move operational scale from here, look, we get that much more impact. And that relationship holds forever and ever. And that's an overly simple way to think about it, that if we double our operational scale, we get double the good. And we know that's not true in the real world. So take, for example, vaccines. As we vaccinate more and more people, the relationship doesn't look like this. The relationship tends to look like that, right? Because there's something which is known as herd immunity. The more people you vaccinate, the more they benefit the unvaccinated, because they reduce the probability that somebody is going to be exposed to the disease, even if they're not vaccinated. So that's one notion of a nonlinear scaling effect. And this is sort of a positive return to scale. Think about another example with youth employment. If you train more and more people to get the same kind of job, at some point, it has a diminishing return, right? Because you're going to be flooding the labor market with people with the same skill. And so that's a decreasing or diminishing return to scale. If we think about equity, and you want to put a policy in place that's going to create a more equitable educational process for young people. Again, it's probably not a straight line where the more you work on developing the policy, the more equity you get. It probably looks something like this, like a tipping point, where you're working and working and working on that policy and nothing really happens until the policy is passed, and then boom, you have a big effect. So when you're planning scaling and you think about the relationships that you have that are cause and effect, one of the questions that I think is important to answer is, how many plausible scaling effects can you anticipate? Is it going to get easier or harder for us to create impacts as we scale? Right? And what will it depend on? Are there potential tipping points that we should be concerned with? And this is This is not easy to do, but if you've done this in advance, it makes the management and evaluation of scaling much easier because you've identified points in time and sets of characteristics that are really worthy of observation and some kind of control or management. You want to make sure that you're getting to the places that are going to make the impacts happen more quickly, and you're going to avoid the places where it could have a negative effect. All right, we're got about 9 minutes left. I've covered a lot. I would say a kind of frightening amount of material in the short time that we had in a context that's a little bit unusual for me. You know, the sort of silent void. But I guess this is probably a good time for us to wrap up. Questions, comments? All right. So let me do a little wrap up. There we are, our book launch, New York City. It was exciting. I think we still have a lot more work to do, and we're excited to engage in that. So really, if there's one thing I'm hoping you can take away today, is this idea of developing a different mindset around scaling, to get beyond the scaling imperative and simply connecting scaling with more and bigger. That there's more to this than that. And when you ask the people who are affected by scaling, this is what they're going to tell you, that there are qualitative kinds of change that they're looking to see that aren't captured in the idea of more. There are 4 principles that we've used to summarize what we learned from Southern innovators. And I think that they can help. Justification, optimal scale, coordination, dynamic evaluation. Certainly in my work, they've been something I've been able to go back to and begin to organize the way I'm either supporting managers or engaging in the planning process or doing the evaluation. We focused a lot of our attention on dynamic evaluation, in part because that's where I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about scaling right now. And I hope that that's helped you think about it, not just as an evaluator, but also as someone who may be a designer or a manager. But it's pretty clear from our work that the more you begin to think about scaling, the more you realize that there are new challenges for all of us who are involved, and that we don't have ready-made tools to help us do that. So that it's going to require more effort on our part to do this well and to really see a world that we think is better. All right, so I think probably if there are no more questions, we have about 5 more minutes. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your thank yous. If you have any questions, please connect with me. I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.